Now to our main speaker. Colleen Ryan needs no introduction, so I won't give her one, except to say that she is one of the outstanding journalists in Australia. She's got the big five in safari terms. She's been a fantastic reporter and writer. She's been a terrific commentator. She's been an excellent foreign correspondent, and she's been a terrific editor and a wonderful investigator. That's the big five. You can count on one hand the number of people who've got the big five in Australia. You can fill in the blanks, but there's a lot of good reporters who are bad editors, and there's a lot of bad reporters who turned out to be good editors. Colleen's got the lot. She's also got the big quinella in Australian journalism. She's a former Graham Perkin Australian Journalist of the Year Award, and she's also won the Gold Walkley. She's now written a second book on Fairfax. I haven't finished it yet. I'm reading it slowly because it's too painful. I'm reading it in small doses. Please welcome Colleen Ryan.
Well, I'm never going to get any awards for my public speaking, so I'm terrified of microphones. Please take that into account. Actually, the last time I spoke to an audience at the Melbourne Press Club was 20 years ago. And the occasion was the Graham Perkin Award. And Conrad Black had recently, as leader of the Turan Consortium, gained control of Fairfax. Much more recently, Steve Mulholland had been brought from South Africa to be the new chief executive of Fairfax. And this was one of his first public outings. Mulholland was to be the keynote speaker. I won the Perkin Award that night, and no one was more surprised than I was, because the runner-up, or highly commended, was David Wilson. And David and I had both been heavily involved in the battle to keep Packer and Turang out of Fairfax. I was on the Friends of Fairfax committee, and David and people like Claude were key members of the Age Independence Committee. So Mulholland chose this occasion to really lay into Fairfax journalists. He really lashed out. He accused the journalists of having an unwarranted obsession with the media, and he said Fairfax journalists had engaged in a journalistic orgy of self-importance. I know Mike was there that day, and I think I can speak for him and for the rest of us in the audience that we were absolutely horrified. He was our new chief executive, and he'd started out belting us from day one. But this is 20 years further on, and I've written my second book on Fairfax, and perhaps Mulholland was right. Perhaps I do have an obsession with the media. But this is a book I really wanted to write. I really wanted to tell the Fairfax story as I saw it. There are thousands of journalists who've worked for Fairfax over the last 40 or 50 years, probably tens of thousands, and every one of them has an informed view of what's happened to Fairfax and why it's struggling to survive today. But this is my view, it's not everyone's, and I understand that. My thesis is that Fairfax was built up in blocks and destroyed in blocks. There's no one single person or event or technology that's brought Fairfax to its present vulnerable position on its own. All media groups are threatened by the internet. But in Australia, as most of us know, Fairfax is the Kodak of the newspaper industry. It's suffered the worst hit. That's partly because it was complacent about its revenue stream, its stranglehold on classified ads for jobs, homes and cars, and partly because it had so far to fall. It did have that stranglehold, unlike other groups like News. And I guess it was too reliant on the revenue from the classifieds. Eric Beach has written a piece in the latest issue of the Monthly, and he points out that when the internet arrived, Fairfax had 56% of its revenue came from classified ads. Other great newspapers like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune were much more like 18 to 20%. So when that revenue went, Fairfax was really in a bad space. But I think Fairfax suffered the worst hit mostly because of incompetent management and a board that had little media experience. And because when the internet did arrive, Fairfax was already seriously weakened by a family feud and by a management that was singularly inept in navigating the political process. Now, when I first started out on this book, I thought it was a good human story, a good business story. And it was bookended by two puzzling but, pretty extraordinary characters, young Warwick and Gina Reinhardt. But now, after spending 12 months researching and writing it, I consider it an amazing human, business and political story spanning 170 years. I lived and worked through 40 of those years at Fairfax, and some of you here did the same. And I thought I had a pretty good handle on what was going on. But when you're living through it, you miss crucial turning points and you underplay the significance of, or overplay the significance of certain people and certain events. And there were a few events and a few pieces of journalism that had a real impact on the direction of Fairfax when you start putting the puzzle together and getting it all into context. I'll just touch on them briefly, but one of them was courtesy of Rupert Murdoch, and that was the birth of the Australian newspaper. It brought a bolder approach to journalism, a cleaner design, and it really shook up the then very conservative Fairfax and Syme organisations. And 2 years later, there was the purchase of a stake in David Syme by the Fairfax family, the Fairfax Public Company, when the Syme family couldn't hold the ownership together any longer. Ronald McDonald, still in his 20s, was the managing director of Syme, and he'd appointed Graham Perkin as editor. And I think McDonald and Perkin together had a fresher, riskier approach to journalism at the age, and I believe that had quite an impact, undoubtedly, on the new generation of Fairfax editors in Sydney. The third key event was the appointment of James Fairfax as chairman in 1977. I was there then. I saw the handover from his father, Sir Warwick. Sir Warwick was sacked and James came on board. But I didn't understand just how important that transition to James was. And James was a true believer in editorial independence. And he said to me when I went down to Barrel to speak to him to research for this book, he said, look, sacking my father was the hardest thing I ever had to do. So after that, it didn't bother me what politicians said. It didn't bother me what Kerry Packer said. And he genuinely understood the Fourth Estate. He's a good man. Then, of course, and more obviously, there was the change in the media laws in 1986 by Paul Keating that saw the Murdoch organisation end up with the Herald and Weekly Times from Melbourne and Queensland Press from Brisbane. And that gave them 70% of newspaper circulation in the country. But that really had a huge impact on Fairfax because they were no longer the big boy on the block anymore. And then, of course, came young Warwick very quickly after that, and his disastrous takeover, which ended in the group's receivership. But even after young Warwick had blown the company up and we'd lost the television stations, we'd lost the magazines, we'd lost the regional newspapers, we'd lost the radio stations, it was still a pretty decent organisation. But because Conrad Black and Turan could only get 15 and then 25% of Fairfax, they had control, but they were vulnerable. So what we got then was 10 years of management and board instability. And that's when the media moguls, Rupert Murdoch and Kerry Packer, treated Fairfax like their plaything, I believe. And it was only then that the internet came. So I think Fairfax was in a really bad position by the time we got to the mid to late 90s when the internet was really going to have an impact. But there were also key pieces of journalism that had a real impact on Fairfax. We all know about the age tapes in the mid-1980s and the shadow they cast over High Court judge and beloved Labor figure Lionel Murphy. That was great journalism, and we know about the Age editorial supporting the Whitlam government against the wishes of the Fairfax board, and then the extraordinary work they did on the Kemlani loans affair. And then there was Graham Perkins' editorial on the eve of his death calling for Whitlam's resignation. Go now, go decently, he wrote. But there were two other pieces of journalism, perhaps less well known, that I believe had a really significant impact on Fairfax. Now, one of them was the Askin story, written in 1981 by David Hickey in the National Times. The former Liberal New South Wales Premier Robert Askin died on a Wednesday in 1981. His funeral was the following Monday. In the intervening weekend, before the funeral, the National Times published a major piece, front page, showing Askin's connections with organised crime. The Fairfax board was absolutely horrified. In fact, David Marr told me something the other night that I wish he'd told me before I'd written the book. But Sir Warwick had got his knighthood under Robert Askin, and Sir Warwick and Lady Mary turned up at the funeral, and they were a bit late, and they walked all the way down the front, expecting, of course, to be seated at the front, but there was no seat there for them, and they had to walk right up the aisle and back to the end of the church. So the Fairfax board was horrified. The body was still warm. Max Such was the editorial director at that time, and David Marr was the editor of the National Times, and they knew they had a fight on their hands when the board met on the day after the funeral. But they managed to turn the board around. They said it's been 16 years since Askin became Premier of New South Wales, and not a word had been published about his corruption, even though that corruption was known in key sectors of the community and in Askin's own party. The Fairfax press had been a supporter of Askin. How could the Fairfax board justify that? They couldn't. So they gave a direction that the papers were to focus on investigative journalism and political corruption. This order from the board led to some truly great journalism, but it also created some very powerful enemies. Enemies like Sir Peter Abels, who was a very close friend of then Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Enemies like Neville Wran, the New South Wales Premier, that withdrew all state government advertising from Fairfax newspapers. And it attracted the ire of Paul Keating, as his friendship with property developer Warren Anderson was picked apart. And then there was Kerry Packer and the investigations of the Costigan Royal Commission. But I think that these enemies, and after talking to members of the family as well, in particular Peter Abels and Kerry Packer, helped fan the family feud amongst the Fairfaxes, which admittedly had been simmering for 2 decades, but they helped fan it, and I believe that led ultimately to young Warwick Fairfax making his disastrous takeover of the company and its subsequent receivership. And the Peter Abels stories, if anyone wants to look them up, they were about, they investigated his links with the mafia elements in the Teamsters Union in the US. Another element of the Fairfax story that really surprised me once I started digging into it was just how heated the boardroom battles were, and how much so many of the directors hated one another, frankly. The role of the board over the past 2 decades has been really crucial. Each of the directors I spoke to would eventually make the same comment: I love Fairfax. And some of them would follow it up with, you know I love Fairfax. Brian Powers, David Gonski, Mark Burrows, Ron Walker, John B. Fairfax, I could go on. I believe them. I think they did love Fairfax. I think they also liked being on the board of a prestigious media organisation. And at the end of the day, when the tough decisions had to be taken, the right decisions were often not made. It was really all about them. The ructions within the board, the lack of faith in management, the lack of understanding of a media culture, and then there were the forces on the outside, the media moguls, the politicians, the business enemies. And let's face it, there was also a determination from the day young Warwick took over in 1987 to break the editorial culture of Fairfax. More than a dozen chief executives later, that culture's still there. But the money and the resources to fund it, to back it up, have almost disappeared and are disappearing by the day. Now, I just want to share with you a few of my favourite moments in the book. I'll take you back to 1984. A white-faced Greg Gardner, who was General Manager or Chief Executive of Fairfax, tells Max Such, the editorial director, blokey guy, that he's just had a very angry Paul Keating on the phone. And anyone who remembers Greg Gardner, he was quite a proper guy. And I can just see him standing there saying, he's the treasurer of Australia, and he said he's going to destroy Fairfax. Such chuckled and said, oh, look, that's just Keating. Tell him to ring me. Gardner said, I already did that. And he said, talking to such is like pissing down your own pant leg. So it's classic Keating. Fast forward to 1991 and we're in Kerry Packer's suite in the Savoy in London, and Packer's there for his usual summer sojourn for the cricket, the casinos, the polo. And on this particular occasion he's dressed in shorts and he's barking at his Portuguese waiter that he brought with him from Sydney along with some of his furniture to make himself feel comfortable. And he's just introduced the leader of the Turan Consortium, Conrad Black, to a gathering of investment bankers and brokers. One of them took him aside and said, are you sure Conrad won't be a problem? Kerry said, oh look, don't worry about Conrad, he hasn't got any real money, which turns out to probably right. Go forward another 4 years, it's December 1995, we're still in London. Kerry Packer's there as well, but this time he's in Rupert Murdoch's office at News International. The two of them had been fighting tooth and nail for almost 12 months over the Super League battle. But this was a very civilised meeting, just 1.5 hours. And they drew up a plan to divide Australia's media between them. This time, Rupert would get Fairfax. The News Limited papers, no problem. Ken Cowley could buy those. It didn't happen, but the arrogance of those two men that they thought that they could sit there and do that just astounds me. A decade further on, and we're in the Fairfax boardroom. Mark Burrows, the director of Fairfax, is staring down Fred Hilmer, the hapless chief executive. Did anyone give you permission to go out and sell the company? This time it was Telstra that was going to get Fairfax, no matter that it was still 50% government owned. 3 years later, just after another Fairfax board meeting, we've got an entirely different set of characters. Casino developer and Formula One promoter Ron Walker's chairman. John B. Fairfax is the major shareholder. A member of the family has come back. And John B. wants to dig deeper to see why the company is floundering. He was given very short shrift by Walker. Walker said, look, we've made you a billionaire. Why do you want to meddle with the company? So with this cast of characters and this style of corporate bastardry, is it any wonder that Fairfax is in such a weak state today? But the reason we all know that it's worth saving for all of us and for the standard of public debate in this country is the great journalism that it's produced over the years. To go forward, you have to know where you came from, and I really hope this book helps, because Fairfax is worth saving for all of us. So where do we stand now? We have a chief executive who says that Fairfax has cost-cutting in its DNA. We've seen some great and experienced journalists leave the company. Admittedly, Fairfax let them go with a heavy heart, but it let them go nevertheless. And we see revenues falling faster than the management can cut costs. I think there are three possible scenarios for the future of Fairfax. One is that Gina Rinehart will make a full takeover bid. I think that's unlikely. She's hardly moved in the last 12 months. And she's got the Roy Hill multi-billion-dollar project to get off the ground in an environment when mining's starting to fail, or not fail, but slow down a little. The second one is that Gina and the institutions and fund managers who make up about 80% of the shareholding today will put the pressure on Fairfax management to break up the company, saying, you know, we want our money back now. And that could lead to maybe Ron Walker and a consortium of Melbourne businessmen having the Age. Gina might take the Sydney Morning Herald or the Financial Review. Stingo would definitely take the radio stations. They might float off the regional newspapers into a separate company. But the third scenario, and this is the one that I hope happens, is that Hywood and Roger Corbett will hold on to the support of the shareholders for the next 3 years, just as they transition to digital, and that they'll succeed in stabilising the revenue so they have enough money to fund quality journalism as best they can. It's really hard to imagine Fairfax returning to the great media empire it once was. I don't think it can. But if the mastheads can be kept and the culture can be kept alive and nurtured, then there's hope that the level of national debate will be kept strong and government and businesses will be held accountable by a brave media that has the funds to do it. The infrastructure is still there, even if the funds are not, and it's vital that it's preserved. But there's no doubt there's work to be done to bring Fairfax back to the former status it had in the community. This was brought home to me a couple of weeks ago on a Sunday morning. I was sitting on the couch watching The Insiders, and it was the day after the Age editorial asking Julia Gillard to step down, which I thought was a beautifully written editorial. But regardless of what your view of it was, Barry Cassidy and his panellists were dismissive, even derisive. Cassidy said, "Isn't there an element of who do they think they are?" That would never have been said in the 70s. I mean, they are the Age editor and the editorial writers. This is the newspaper that asked Whitlam to step down, and this is what great newspapers do, and we seem to have forgotten that. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Those who have a question, please stand up, throw your voice and identify yourself. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. First one. Must be some question. We've got a lot of Fairfax refugees here, don't we? Yep.
When Greg Hywood went onto the board, I think a lot of people in the business, especially journalists, thought, well, that was a terrific job. Journalists, there's someone that come work for the ranks as a journalist. And Greg has now been, of course, in the role as chief executive. Do you think Greg now has all the possible tasks to try and bring together new media, and how long do you think the Age and the Sydney Herald will be able to get to
Right. Look, I'd hate to be in Greg's position, and particularly after I went around and interviewed the fund managers who are the, some of the major shareholders of Fairfax. They're really putting the pressure on him. People like Simon Murray from Alan Gray, he says, look, Fairfax is not about journalism. Fairfax is about money for shareholders. Yes, it provides quality journalism and Australia needs it, and I know they need it, but that's not my problem and it's not management's problem. They've got to make a profit for shareholders. And his argument is that Australians just refuse to pay for quality journalism, and frankly we've never had to pay for it because the classified ads did. And they've got the ABC. Greg Hywood has people like that in his ear day in, day out. Murray says that Fairfax has to cut costs by 10 to 15% a year, every year for the next 10 years. And he said when he speaks to management, they say, but, we've got a union agreement, we have to put up wages by such and such a percent. And Murray says, well, just don't do it. Where are they going to go? There's no jobs anywhere else. And so it's a lot of pressure on Greg, a lot of pressure, and it must have nearly killed him to see those 1,900 people leave the company. And he gets a lot of criticism for not being as upbeat as Kim Williams on the day that he announced the 1,900 redundancies. Williams managed to, do a song and dance and put a gloss on where news was at that particular time, and he had a better story to tell. So I feel sorry for him, and I think he's got an impossible job, and I think he's been handed a poison chalice. Will the Age and the Herald continue as a printed product Monday to Friday for the next 3 years? I don't think so. I think Hywood's made it fairly clear that he wants to go to digital as soon as he can. And I actually think that's a mistake, because you lose a lot of the branding. Just the Age outside the newsagents, or the Age sitting on a coffee table. It reminds people that, oh, I wonder what's in the Age. But if it's not there 5 days a week, is it going to matter as much? And, it still matters, but are as many people going to look at it? So I think that's a real mistake, but I don't know what I'd do in his position.
Question, sorry. Yeah, this table, the nearer table, yep.
Sorry, Kat, we'll be on ABC Radio. I was interested in your comments about the editorial about Julia Gillard.
Yes.
While I understand the other editorials that you mentioned, it was the first time that the Age actually called for a Prime Minister to actually step down while in government.
Well, Whitlam was Prime Minister when Graham Perkin asked him to step down. I know, it's a big call, and as long as it's being done in the leaders section and not, within the news stories in a campaign on the front pages of the paper, I think it is a role the role of the Fourth Estate, I think, is to keep business and government accountable.
Next question.
Thank you, Peter Breuer. I've noticed that the ABC really effectively has now gone into the print media when one looks at the internet presence of the ABC. So effectively it covers all aspects of media as far as I can see. What are the private sector lobbyists doing to try and break up the ABC? Is there a push to do that, or are we all going to lie down and be content with the government broadcaster?
Look, it's a really good argument, and it's one that's being had in Britain as well about the BBC. I was talking to a senior ABC broadcaster the other day, off the record, and he was saying, well, there is an argument that perhaps the ABC should stick to broadcasting, which is what it does very well, and not have something like the Drum in print. And so I can see that argument, because it does. There is a crowding out element for the the privately owned or publicly listed companies, but privately owned media. But I just can't agree with it, because for me, at the end of the day, what we want is informed comment and gutsy journalism, and I think that leads to a better civil society. I think the private sector just has to compete, and from where I sit, it's thank God for the ABC.
Another question here.
Sue Wilson, I'm curious about the aspect that you mentioned about online and also developing an audience. I'm curious, you talk a lot about saving the journalist job and providing service to the community, but you say that we all expect journalism for free. We're actually finding a number of people pay for quality content now, and that they are prepared to do that. So what, in your mind, with your experience, will engage the readers more and wanting to support Fairfax?
Well, I don't know that people, I mean, even with the new model, if I want to, which I do, subscribe to the SMH online, it's still less than if I bought the paper every day. And the cover price of the paper has never gone anywhere near paying for the cost of good journalism. I think we actually need to pay a lot more to get good quality journalism, and people are prepared to do it with The Economist and so forth, but I think there has to be a change in the mindset that this is something you do have to pay for. Simone Murray says it would cost 3 cups of coffee a year for each and every Australian to fund a Fairfax type organisation, and it's not a lot, but people have to be prepared to do it. I think Eric Beecher thinks we might be able to do it in a compulsory way with some sort of TV type tax that the BBC is funded by. But it does take money. You need money for lawyers and barristers, and online startups are a long way off having that sort of money compared to the traditional media organisations.
But as an Australian, I'm a sick guy. So if you gave that message to me, I'd say, well, yeah, I'll put my hand in. So where is the reader buying it? So for instance, SBS came to me and said, I want to do a story on Australian expatriates. And I said, nobody would be interested in that. They don't want to hear about what fabulous thing you're doing in Paris every weekend. But they said, oh yeah, it's different with soccer. We've got a team, we've got a club we support, we're interested in the game every week, there's player profiles. There's a whole story and engagement with the person consuming the journalism that way. But it doesn't necessarily occur obviously at the moment, otherwise we're going downhill.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I understand the question there, sorry, but I think what you're saying is people are prepared to pay for it, and it's up to the journalists to get them engaged enough to pay for it. But I think it requires a complete mindset change.
Sally.
While I agree that you may be right in terms of the economics of it, what concerns me about the notion of paying full price for quality journalism is that there is possibly a tendency to split our community between the haves who can pay and the have-nots who have to listen to shock jocks.
That's right. That's true. And
What's the implication for democracy?
well, information becomes in the hands of the elite. We see that a little bit with anyone who really wants to know about Indonesia now has to pay Stratfor or someone like that to really find out about it, whereas once they would have been able to read, day after day in the Financial Review, but there's no correspondence out there. I know there are other correspondents, but so the making information elite only for the elite is a real problem. And maybe what purveyors of good journalism have to do is find a platform that actually gives enough revenue to be able to produce the product. That would be the ideal.
At the back, yep.
Hi, Rupert. What impact do you think the Guardian's arrival here as a local version will have on Fairfax and the readership of Fairfax as a publication?
Yeah, I think it'll have an impact, and it's great to see it arrive. But at the same time, it's only 5 or 6 journalists at this stage. I mean, it's a bit different to having 1,200, in an organisation. But and look, the other upside is the power of the media moguls is reduced with the spread of information and the spread of online and things like the Guardian and the Daily Mail coming in. So I think it's a great thing, but it will impact Fairfax a bit. Yeah.
Any more questions? We've got time for 1 or 2 more.
I have a question.
Tony.
Let me ask you a personal question. My former editor, and possibly relevant to some of us of my generation. Colleen, this is a life after journalism.
Well, writing books brings in about 1/10 of what being a journalist does, so I don't think that's the case. Well, my life after journalism is Byron Bay, where I hope to write corporate crime fiction and enjoy myself. But I'm at the age where I can do that. For the others, I think it's getting into the online and the multimedia and pushing it out there that's going to be the future. Okay, thanks very much.
You get 1/10 of a salary from publishing. Who's your publisher?
Louise Adler.
Thank you. I was lucky enough to escape from Fairfax just after Conrad Black arrived, or got pushed off the ledge, however you want to put it. I thought my sort of few years there in editing positions was tough. In rapid succession, I had the privatisation by Warwick Fairfax, which was a disaster. He was bringing in crooks to become directors and financiers. Then we had a receiver, and then we had a recession. Warwick was easy to handle. He was so scared of journalists and editors, he never showed his face or got his henchmen. And one of the most memorable things I can think about that period was that while he was supposedly in charge, we were able to run a series on the front page about one of his crooked directors, Laurie Connell, under the heading, under the Dinkers WA Inc., which was the first coining of that expression, which sat around for 20 years. It was one of the few stories I felt obliged to show to my managing director before publication. He didn't have a problem, and I don't think Warwick even read it. He didn't read newspapers. The receiver was probably the best boss I ever had, and certainly the best boss that's been there since. The receiver, more than all these clowns that have been through the place before, since then, actually understood that there was commercial value in good journalism, and he never interfered and never stuffed up budgets for us. He was actually very supportive of the journalists, because he knew in the mood the journalists were in that if he picked a fight with them, then that would be bad for the sale of the company, which was his job. But the third thing, the recession, that was the toughest. I mean, because that was the only thing that hit our budgets. Recessions hit newspapers, particularly those that rely on classified ads, quicker than anywhere else. And that was the toughest time that I was running the place from the editor's chair, the actual recession. The clowns were easy to deal with. But the ones that came later for the next 20 years, well, I got a lot of respect for Greg Hywood. I think they've got the right man there now. But all those before him were just had no idea what good journalism was and what the link between good journalism and the brand and the value of the company was. And Colleen's covered a bit of this in her book. Thank you for coming, Colleen. We've all enjoyed it. I think we all hope that there's a third Fairfax book in you, and we hope that that's a much more positive one when the mess that surrounds the company at the moment is settled down, and Hywood and others can find a solution that keeps quality journalism in this country competitive and going on, so that the public benefits. Thank you, Colleen. There are copies of her books for sale back here. I'm sure she wouldn't mind signing some. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you at the next lunches with Mitchell and Fane, the New Rivers of Gold people, and the Hall of Fame. Thank you very much.